G'day, welcome to Lunchtime Agenda. I'm David Lipson. 5 years after the last Australian soldiers withdrew from a protracted and unpopular conflict in Iraq, a small number of Australian troops is going back in. A statement from a spokesman for the Defence Minister reads, "I can confirm that a small ADF liaison element has been deployed to the Australian Embassy in Baghdad to support security arrangements. Defence will not comment further due to security considerations." The troops will be uniformed Defence personnel. The exact number at this point is not clear. This is just one of the topics we're going to discuss today on Lunchtime Agenda. And I want to bring in our panel for the program today, Paul Fletcher, the Parliamentary Secretary for Communications, and Michael Danby, the Shadow Parliamentary Secretary to Bill Shorten. Thank you both for your company this afternoon. Paul Fletcher, first to you, just on this troop deployment. This is a decision that would not have been taken lightly.
Well, look, that's right, but obviously, given the national security nature of this, it's not really possible to say anything more than the very brief statement that's come from the Defence Minister. We have made clear, the Prime Minister's made clear, the Foreign Minister's made clear that we are extremely concerned about what's occurring in Iraq. The opposition has indicated its bipartisan support in relation to those concerns. These are very troubling developments, what we've seen in Iraq over recent days. But in terms of the specific announcement today, obviously there's nothing more that can be said.
But can you give any sort of assurance that the small number of soldiers who are there for the protection of Australian staff at the embassy won't grow, that we won't be drawn into Iraq in a greater role?
Well, I think the Prime Minister has been very, very clear in relation to what he said on that. We are obviously watching the situation carefully, but taking a very, very cautious approach. And I do emphasise what was said in the announcement today. They're there for a very specific reason in relation to the embassy. To draw any broader conclusion of that from that would be quite unfounded.
Michael Danby, Labor's test on Australia's involvement in Iraq, although this isn't involvement in the conflict per se, has been that it has to be in the national interest. One would assume that this is in Australia's best interests?
Well, protecting our diplomats is clearly our interest. I don't think anyone's seriously talking about re-engagement in military boots on the ground there. That would be absurd. But it's an indication, David, of how bad the situation is. And if ISIS get to Baghdad, it'll be very difficult to evacuate our diplomats by aeroplane. So they probably need to military escort to take them back out south through Basra.
Michael Danby, just on ISIS, what do you think of the threat that was raised yesterday, posed by Australians who have gone over to Syria and Iraq to fight under ISIS, returning to this country?
I think the Director General of ASIO more than a year ago started to identify this problem of dual passport holders who are fighting with the ultra jihadis in Syria and now in Iraq as the biggest security problem for this country. I think that's not just a problem for Australia, it's a problem for the United States and for Britain and Germany. Prime Minister Cameron in the United Kingdom just said that these people are intending to attack the United Kingdom, and if it's going to happen to them, it may happen to us. I would just remind all of your viewers and you, David, that the first of these jihadis returned and killed the 4 people in the museum in Brussels. He was just arrested by luck at the Marseille bus station, where they found the Kalashnikov that he used to kill people. He trained in Syria. He's one of these people. This is the nightmare that all of our countries have, including Australia, that these people will return and deploy their deadly skills.
OK, well, to security issues closer to home, and there's been another dramatic protest incident involving the Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop. Take a look at these fairly dramatic pictures. After opening the C20 conference at the University of Melbourne this morning, the Foreign Minister was ushered into her waiting car, but as it drove away, one protester lunged at the car, was almost run over in the process as he was tackled to the ground and ultimately arrested by police. His grievance was the budget.
Right, this government is a government that's wanting to make the universities two-tier system, one for the rich and one for the poor. Shame!
The Prime Minister said that that sort of behaviour is essentially un-Australian.
Very, very rarely there are protests. Occasionally those protests get ugly. That shouldn't happen. I don't think it's a very Australian thing to do, to try to prevent someone from speaking, prevent someone from visiting some place where their duty calls them.
Paul Fletcher, all sides of politics condemn this sort of behaviour, this sort of personal attack on ministers and shadow ministers for that matter, or any person. But is it really un-Australian, as the Prime Minister suggested there?
Well, he's obviously making the point that where you're resorting to using physical violence, intimidation and so on to try and prevent anybody, be it a minister, a parliamentarian or be it an ordinary member of the community, from speaking, from expressing an opinion, from participating in a forum, that certainly is not consistent with our democratic values. And one of the very important values is freedom of speech, that people have the opportunity to express their views, and for politicians, amongst others, to go around putting their perspectives, making the case, in this case, for particular policy measures. And when you have people who are effectively trying to block that through physical presence, physical intimidation, well, I think that is something very much to be deplored.
Michael Danby, what do you make of this protest this morning?
Well, personal violence against anyone involved in politics is absolutely unacceptable. I work on the basis with Tony Abbott that something can be true even if he says it's true. The budget's very unpopular, but there's no excuse for people trying to physically intimidate each other because of political differences.
Paul Fletcher, is it a sign, though, of just how upset some people are? Obviously, these people are on the fringe, but how upset some people are about the budget?
Oh, look, I think that's drawing a fairly long bow. We are a country in which people certainly are free to express their opinion, as the Prime Minister has said. He doesn't condone, I certainly don't condone that kind of physical attack, but that being said, certainly people are free to express their opinion, that we have a robust democracy. That's important, but I think it would be drawing a long bow to draw any broader conclusion.
OK, I want to look at this issue that bubbled up and potentially over the past few weeks, and that is the terminology relating to East Jerusalem. It started with George Brandis a couple of weeks ago and ended with threats to Australian trade into Arab and Islamic nations. Now, the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation has met overnight in relation to Australia's position on East Jerusalem and released their declaration, which reads that the OIC condemns the orientation of the Australian government not to describe the city of East Jerusalem as occupied, and reiterates that this orientation contradicts international law and requests member states to condemn such illegal positions and take necessary measures to respond to them. Now, I'm told that this declaration was made without taking the government's clarification yesterday into account. The Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, met with many of the concerned ambassadors here at Parliament House yesterday and largely allayed their concerns. Paul Fletcher, was all of this worth it? Was all of it worth changing the language for?
Well, the key point to make is that there hasn't been any change in the government's position. The Australian government has long supported a two-state solution under which the Israeli and Palestinian people can live together peacefully. and that continues to be the government's position. Julie Bishop, as the Foreign Minister, has made it clear that there's been no change in the government's policy position.
Do you concede, though, that there was a change of language?
Well, there's been a bit of intense back and forth about terminology. The Foreign Minister has made the point, she's been on radio this morning, making the point that the geographical description of the area we're talking about is East Jerusalem. There's been an attempt to, I guess, argue that there's some broader consequence from a particular set of words that the Attorney General used during estimates. The Foreign Minister has made the point on radio this morning that you need to see that in the context of the question that was being asked by him by the Greens, which sought to use the phrase occupied East Jerusalem as a geographical descriptor. The Foreign Minister's made the point the geographical descriptor that the Australian government uses is East Jerusalem. She's also made the more fundamental point there has been no change in the Australian government's policy.
Michael Danby, what's, first of all, Labor's position on what's happened here?
Well, I think we're a bit taken aback by what appeared to be a change in terminology, but I agree with Paul. We all agree with a two-state solution. That's the big picture as far as all of us are concerned. Even if the status of some parts of East Jerusalem is small o occupied, it doesn't prevent there being the main game taking place, negotiations between the two parties. One of the important parts of those negotiations is possible land swaps, which would incorporate some of the suburbs around Jerusalem in an Israeli state and have equal land transfers, to be fair, to a new Palestinian state. The point is, David and Paul, we're not going to decide this from here in Australia, and to have this issue focused on is really sort of not really in the the national interest. We're not going to decide this issue here, and
we may not decide it here, but the point is also
going on.
The point is also, as you well know, that language is very important, particularly in this so sensitive issue and so sensitive area. And there were threats of trade sanctions. And if you read this declaration from the OIC, take necessary measures to respond to what it says are a contradiction to international law. Is it worth putting Australian trade at risk? There are reports that some $3.5 billion was at risk.
Well, perhaps if I can respond to that, I think it's pretty clear from what the Foreign Minister has said yesterday and today, the meetings that she's convened with ambassadors of the many Arab states, it's pretty clear that the Australian government is making it absolutely clear there's been no change in position, no change in policy, and we warmly value the strong relations that Australia has with many nations in the Middle East of many different kinds and complexions.
Okay. We're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time. Paul Fletcher, Michael Danby, thanks so much for your comments and insights this afternoon. After the break, we'll hear from